screen, correct?
Yes, it does. So whenever you're ready to get started, you can pull it up and I'll kind of give the intro and then off you go.
All right, let me make sure I'm open and up. All right, are you seeing the screen?
There we go. Perfect. All right. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Today's presentation is part of the Culture Builds Communities webinar series. This community-based project is designed to help Native communities plan and develop cultural facilities. Culture Builds Communities is a project of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Major funding is provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Museum of the American Indian, and Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies. All right, it's all yours, Sam.
All right, welcome to the site selection, analysis, and design portion of the webinar series. This is going to build off of Dee's and Sean's presentations from before, building up to an overall process of helping getting a facility up and running. As you know, Sean has presented. So the first thing I wanted to start off with was culture first. I think that skipped a few slides, sorry. My name is Samuel Bexon. I'm an architect in Minneapolis. I own a firm called Full Circle Indigenous Planning, and I do a lot of overall master planning and site selection, as we're talking about. I'm also a principal at Cunningham Group. And the first thing I want to talk about is that, again, culture. Whenever I start a project, we always say culture first. I've been taught by my elders that everything is related: the earth, sky, people, animals, plants. Culture and environment are intimately tied together. To live in a way that does not hurt the environment, and to respectfully and thankfully utilize natural resources. And buildings can honor these values. And that starts with the program and the site and how you use it. I wanted to start off with a few images of different amazing sites that are around the country that Indigenous people here have utilized, from the Southwest and the Northeast to the forests of Minnesota, to the plains and to the Pacific Northwest. All very different climates, all very different materials that are available, all different cultures. I was taught that culture emerges from the landscape, and the landscape allows you to live in a certain way, and you honor and respect that place in your environment. When I first started practicing architecture out of school, I lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is on the left. That is the essentially the site where I lived. And on the right is where my grandma lived up north in Ball Club on the Leech Lake Reservation in Minnesota. So two very, very different landscapes, sites, just in my life itself. So one of the big questions I had is how do you respond to that from a cultural perspective? Either a city or a rural area, urban, mountains. So the importance of selecting the right site. So establishing your project goals. That's one of the first things we need to do. I won't read all of these, but essentially your site wants to support all of the goals that you're trying to establish in your project. That it has the right features, it's the right size, it has utilities, that it aligns with your budget, that the legal and jurisdictional laws support it. So there's a lot of different features and things to consider. So when do you begin the site selection process? If you remember this diagram about the overall design process, starting from the research and design and the permit and the building of it. Well, at some point you have to decide where you're going to do all this. And usually it happens where I've got it drawn there is that you got a site, you have a kind of an idea of what you want to do, and then you start into conceptual design based on that. Sometimes, though, you start off with the building. And I have two projects doing this right now where they know they want the building and they know they want the function, and they know how big it is, and they basically know what it wants to look like, but they haven't established where the site is for that. So I have one project that is on a site, and it's either going to be within 1,000 feet of itself in certain directions. So that really changes it, what will actually be designed in the subsequent phases. Another project, they want a religious facility, cultural facility, and they know what they want it to look like, but again, they don't know where it's going to be. There's also a site selection process where you don't even know what you're going to build yet. You acquire a site, and then what you want to do is you want to find its highest and best use. This happens a lot with development, not necessarily with cultural facilities, but a developer might buy a site, and then they might decide, okay, what's the best thing that's going to go on here? But that doesn't necessarily apply to the types of projects that we're looking at. I'm going to borrow these from previous presentations, but first of all, you have to figure out kind of what and how big it's going to be. Again, Sean went through this. You want to know what's going to happen in the facility. All these things are going to start to give you the sizes and the relationships of all these spaces. So now we're going to start to understand how big it is, what types of functions are happening there, and then again, borrowing again, the owner, architect, contractor, all of these can be utilized at the beginning of a project to help with that site selection. It's often hard for a facility to simply just start selecting a site without understanding the site, the geotechnical aspects of it. Are there any hazardous materials? So there's a lot of due diligence that you need to engage your professionals on, engineers, architects, a cost estimator. A contractor early on board can help you understand the different pros and cons of a site. Some of the physical factors are land use related plans and policies. One of the biggest things is this on trust land versus fee simple land? That's incredibly important for tribal communities because there are different laws. Tribal communities are sovereign nations, so they dictate the codes, the policies, the zoning, transportation. Can people actually get to the site? You want the public to come to a museum? Are there parts of the facility that you want only the community to come? There's environmental, all of the physical factors, the topography, the vegetation, the habitat, the wetlands, all these things have major implications to what you can and can't do on a site. And it helps you determine sometimes that that site is not even good for the project. I've had multiple sites where after the due diligence, the owner decided to either abandon the project or move to a completely different site. We also have to understand what's in the earth. You know, what is the stability of the soil? Can you even build a building? Can you build a 4-story building? Could it only be 1 story? And then utilities. Utilities are incredibly important for a site. Oftentimes in tribal development, there are greenfield sites that have no sewer, no electricity. So all of these things are major considerations for costing and determining the financial feasibility of a project. I had a project recently where they didn't realize that there wasn't enough water to the site, so they had to build a water tower for a couple $1 million, and so we had to shave money off of the project in different aspects of that just to make that work. And then from another physical factors is just simply utilizing the sun and utilizing passive solar strategies. You can save a lot of money in utilities. You can save a lot of money in lights to really listen to the land, listen to the landscape, listen to the sun, the topography, and utilizing wind to help heat and cool. And then sustainable site development is incredibly important. This is a project we're doing in Wisconsin. It's a large campus, and it's almost net zero in terms of building. Every once in a while during the year, we're actually putting energy into the grid. It's a large facility, but even so, we're able to design the site, utilize natural resources to allow that to happen. So I'm going to start getting into some case studies. I first started the presentation with a lot of really boring charts and diagrams, but I thought some really actual applications No offense to any previous presenter, but I think the tangibility of seeing seeing something actually happen is important. So this is actually one of my very first projects. I did a workshop in Minneapolis and on the Leech Reservation to talk about overall community master planning. And there was talks about how do you do sustainable development, looking at the overall tribal community. And what's interesting is that instead of one building, the community decided they wanted 4 or 5 buildings. That one building really wasn't going to serve the population that they wanted to. So we looked at different ways to spread out the different facilities throughout the community. So again, that's another aspect of site planning is understanding exactly what it is you're trying to do. What are you accomplishing? Are you really trying to serve the people? If you build in one area of a reservation, does that exclude people on the other side of the reservation? And so there's a really important community engagement aspect of doing this. This is a project for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota that we did. And as you can see, it's cited as an object in the forest. It really wanted to be apart from the overall broader non-native community. It is a sacred area where people come do ceremonies, and it really wanted to be, again, off the highway, embedded in the heart of the community, and really a very private location, which is very different than if you have a museum. This band also has a museum, and it's sited directly off the busiest highway in the community. I'm going to go through a project I did for the Ho-Chunk Madison community. This was a project where they had an existing gaming facility, but they wanted to have a cultural center. And they also wanted to understand what are all the possible uses that could happen on this site. So this is going to be a lot of slides, but I thought this would be good to show you the level of investigation that can be done to actually make a project feasible. Again, starting off with culture first, looking at traditions, use of the land, different sources of inspiration. Now they are in the middle of Wisconsin. The red dot is the site where they own the property, and it's in a medium-sized city. And so we started off with the broader perspective of looking at many different things that would impact that site, because we understood that it wasn't just about the site that you can just directly see from that particular piece of property, but the city itself was growing. And so understanding this red line is where the city was going to grow, we understood that this project was going to be in the middle of the city in about 20 years. And again, off highways, we wanted to understand both the opportunities and constraints. And I'll go through these a little quickly. There's a lot of diagrams here, but it's about the analysis of, okay, here's transportation. How are we going to get people here? What are the connections to the surrounding fabric? So we're looking at all the different types of streets. Here are the main ways to actually get to the site off of Highway 18, Highway 90. So understanding the overall political, jurisdictional, demographic areas of the site was incredibly important. We knew that our site was in the center of that intersection right there, and the population was going to essentially dramatically increase in the area. They had a site that had a lot of existing features. There was a highway that was going to be turned into a different type of interchange, and they owned the red parcels that are highlighted there. And again, we're looking at all this from the standpoint of where are we going to site their museum. So all of the different factors are at play that we were talking about. We understood that the highway system was going to change. There would be actually less access to the site from the highway because of that. So we had to understand how people would actually get into the site, where they would enter the area, because views, vistas, site location of each of the facilities was incredibly important to understand. So different directions all had a kind of a circuitous, and in this project, it was really difficult to get into the site. The red line shows how a car would drive off the highway. It would have to get off an exit a quarter mile down, backtrack along a frontage road just to get into the site. So we knew that visibility was going to be important. We knew that it really had to be a destination to actually have something work on that site. Another few pathways in. We were promoting connections, pedestrian connections through the neighborhoods that are adjacent. The blue line was a connection across the highway, which, if you don't know, it's really hard to get the US Highway Department to allow you to do something with their highway. But we also understood that there was a lot of greenfield site there. There was a golf course, there was a lot of wetlands. Again, these are all factors that the tribe wanted to consider, and they really wanted to do the due diligence. All right, where do we exactly want this to go? These blue lines show a quarter mile and a half mile walking distance. So they knew that when they got people into this site, that they wanted it to be a pedestrian zone where people could all walk to the museum easily, and so that it was very accessible for both visitors and for the people who lived in the area. There are also multiple jurisdictions touching the site. So I think there were about 4 different cities and suburbs all touching and adjacent to the property. So some of it was city owned, some of it was different suburbs, some of it was parks. They all wanted to say, now this was only partially in trust land. So only the gaming area was under trust. So the rest of it was going to be a mix of different jurisdictional requirements. Looking at green space, looking at zoning to understand what was allowable to be built there. Again, since this wasn't trust land, we have to consider all the site constraints that the jurisdictions are going to put on you. Understanding where cultural sites, where the city was going to grow. Here is a diagram of the wetlands. So immediately they saw that about almost half of their property was in wetlands. And so that was a surprise to them. They didn't understand at first the implications of an impact of that. There's a whole jurisdictional and process for changing sites from wetlands. You can do it, but the obvious goal would be to preserve as much as possible. So again, coming back to all of that analysis and the sites that they had. Here's a composite diagram, which shows essentially all of the different forces and issues that are affecting that site. And so this type of analysis allows us to understand that different forces are impacting a guest experience to the site. It's impacting where parking would be. It's impacting how big of a project that they could build. It's impacting views to and from the highway. It's impacting natural resources. So there's a lot of different factors that go into play before you really want to start siting a building, because if you just start on a site plan and start drawing floor plans, you're likely to end up backtracking further on in the project. So then the process was, after we've done that due diligence, and again, I'm walking you guys through sort of this long, and it's not really drawn out because there were city officials involved, there was an owner's rep, there were community groups, there was consensus building in the process. So this was a multi-year project that was really important to both the city and to the tribe. They were trying to be as good neighbors to each other as possible. And so a lot of dialogue, a lot of studies would happen. It also wanted to be financially feasible for the tribe in order to make it work. So as part of the site selection for it, we did multiple scenarios of where expansion could happen from a retail standpoint. There were some athletic fields, athletic facilities that the city wanted the tribe to engage in as part of the overall complex. There's required amount of parking. So all of these different ideas, if you can see the plans changing as we move, started to develop a strategy for the site. Another thing that was considered was the phasing of it. So where do we build first? What do we build first? And as you can see, this is where the cultural center eventually ended up. That's the red dot in the middle of the site. And these are sketchy diagrams, but they're based on the calculations on the site. So there were strategies about different options. Let's create an intersection of cultural and public facilities. But let's have the cultural facility be able to look out over the fields and over into the wetlands. We wanted to create a pedestrian zone so that people going to the athletic facilities or the retail in the area would all be encouraged to come and utilize the facility. Here's some additional facilities that were happening there. So it's not just about necessarily defining one property. I mean, what the goal in this was, where was the cultural center, but it ended up being a much larger study about where's the cultural center in relationship to all of the different facilities that the tribe wants to build. And this type of comprehensive master planning is really important, and tribes don't always engage in that. If a community builds a building, one building at a time, starting with a facility or a school or the government center, there's missing out on the relationships between the facilities. How do you create a community of buildings, even if they're not going to be built for 10 or 25 years? The pedestrian networks, bike paths, all of these items reinforced the one simple goal of where is this cultural facility going to be. And this area was looked at from a 25-year standpoint, that there would be 4 phases. They would each reinforce the other and would build incrementally on the site. And in the end, this is as far as we got with them, understanding where their gaming and hotel would expand, where their parking would end up. And they are currently trying to get their cultural center off the ground. They have a number of different cultural centers in their community. Ho-Chunks in Wisconsin have multiple different communities. And again, they have a goal of having not just one central one, but multiple facilities. I'll move on to Red Lake Nation. This is in northern Minnesota. This is a facility that is almost under construction. And again, the goal here is to have you understand the thought process of coming from the programming, which we talked about in the last webinar, and how do you translate that into a location on a site. So on the right, we tried different configurations. If you remember the diagrams that Sean showed last time about the different spaces and how they interrelate, how big they are, what are different options, what are the views from them. On the left are different shapes that we explored on the site that could do that. This is the preliminary final rendering. On the right is our preliminary floor plan that takes that diagram to the next stage. It's not really architectural floor plans quite yet, but the important thing about these 2 drawings is on the left. In Red Lake, Minnesota, there is a beautiful large lake, and you can see it to the north. They have 2 government facilities. One's a school and one's a tribal government building to the north. They have a powwow grounds in the center, and they have a Boys and Girls Club off to the left. And so the building that we're looking at is the gray building sort of in the middle right of the screen. And so we had looked at potentially placing that near the water, placing it on an existing site closer to the highway. But in the end, through discussions with the community, the goal was to have the facility really be tied in to the powwow grounds. They have several powwows during the year. They wanted that cultural facility to be part of that overall master plan. Where it's located now in the drawing really reinforces that circle of the powwow ground. It has a view to the lake. You can see it from the government buildings. So again, the facility where it's located is highly dependent on the existing site. What's there, its relationship to the lake. We oriented it so that it would capture sunlight into the building. We oriented it so that you could see it from the highway, so it would draw people into the site. And again, the tribal council can look over their chambers and see their primary cultural facility. Here are some preliminary three-dimensional diagrams, taking cues from culture, both culture and the site. And it created what's going to be they call it their longhouse. So another project is the American Indian Culture Corridor in Minneapolis. And this is a very different type of project because it's very urban. So the first two projects were sort of tribal, rural. But in Minneapolis, it's a relatively urban site. There is a street that is essentially sort of like a Little Italy or a Chinatown, where there's a number of cultural facilities. And so what the community wanted to do was master plan this entire area to reinforce this idea of it being a cultural hub. And some of the things that we looked at were putting in an art gallery. We have two art galleries. We have housing. There is an outdoor festival area, powwow grounds. So this was a little bit broader than simply just one museum or facility, but how do you take and create a number of institutions, compose them all within the existing fabric of a non-native urban site, and create a sense of community for the Native American community. So we looked at on the left, where does it sit within the overall city, downtown, the university, hospitals, other cultural institutions, the highways. Again, all of these things are critical to understanding and creating good decisions for siting in different projects. So on the red circles on the right are the different sites that were available and that were going to be used to infill and create new cultural facilities and amenities. The type of analysis you do at that urban scale is a bit different than what you do at the micro scale. So always looking at the overall forces of the city in a region, understanding the demographics, understanding where it is in relationship to other tribal communities, where the urban Native American population actually lives. All of these things helped to define and reinforce that zone there in the yellow was where essentially the heart of the community, heart of the Native community in Minneapolis is. So out of this study, we bought as a community an old food shelf and converted it into a contemporary arts gallery where community happens. We've developed affordable housing. We are renovating the Minneapolis American Indian Center. And again, all of this is based on that analysis that we did. Through that analysis, we knew that this area here near light rail station was dark, and a lot of not so good things happen here. So we are in the process of changing that into a park. Again, from a cultural landscape standpoint, inserting program. This is a vacant site that is along that corridor, and converting that into a powwow grounds, housing, and And then actually, the Minneapolis American Indian Center is on the left here as well. Here is a strip mall, and it really is just a sea of parking that really takes away from the streetscape that we were trying to create. So we decided to propose and try to court developers who would bring back landscape and park, and again, try to insert our cultural landscape right into the city. Leash Lake Tribal College is another project that I worked on. The red dot in the center is the location of the library, and they have some archives in it right now. Right now, the two brown wings of the building are the only things built at this point. As part of this process, I did a master plan for the entire facility in order, again, to find out where that library would actually want it to be. In this project, they had an existing building, and our job was to create a new facility within the context of that overall master plan, but create a zone for the college to grow in phases over time. And again, they're thinking out many years into the future. So this site analysis and the planning of it and locating it really is based on a lot of due diligence from a lot of community members working together to establish where it is. And this is built now. So that is essentially the presentation. I got through that a lot quicker than I thought I would, but I also wanted to leave time for questions. And again, I didn't want to get too far into the mechanics and the specifics about all the engineering at this part, but I wanted to talk about that whole process of community engagement, getting people together to come up with a vision, and what are all of the different primarily cultural motives for siting a building.
Okay, do we have any questions for Sam? No? Anything?
I have a question of the, oh, go ahead. Selena, so sorry.
Oh, no problem. You were talking at the beginning, especially when you got into about site analysis and strategies, about taking thoughtful time that you could do a lot more research and investigation into the different components about a site selection.
Yeah.
But how does that affect your overall budget as you're doing more considerate research versus maybe what's only like enough for you to be able to start doing development?
Well, if I'm understanding the question, you know, there's a process of visioning that is about, okay, what does this building want to be, and then there's the specifics about one specific site. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
As we as a project gets onto a site and it's selected after all the possible areas are looked at, and you have a site, there are the costs of doing the site survey. There's a cost of doing geotechnical, where they're actually looking at the site and doing borings and understanding what's underneath the earth. There's the cost of looking at the utilities and understanding all the different factors. I think one of the most important things to do is to understand the budget allocated for a site. I had a project. It was a gaming project in North Carolina. They allocated $5 million for the site work, and the site work actually cost $15 million to build. And that's because they didn't understand the topography and the lack of utilities, and it was sort of up on a mountain. And so without that due diligence before they started going, they really got into a lot of trouble, and that delayed the project and created a lot of headaches for the design team and the owner. So as you get onto a site, you want to do that due diligence, and I kind of went quickly through that at the beginning, but you know, the site, the survey topography, you want to know where the hills are, you want to know where the roads are into the site, you want to know where all the different site features that might impact the project. You also want to do an archaeological survey, especially on tribal grounds, because sometimes you find cultural sites, and that really changes your ability to build on that site. So that's important for tribes. So cultural, tribal historians, tribal archaeologists need to be involved in that piece of it. So it's not just the architect and the geotech engineers and the surveyors and the contractors, but community insight and knowledge is incredibly important as well.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, I think the question, the challenge is often schedule for that, because these projects are often funded with grants, and you've made promises to be and have a certain thing done by a certain time. So as much of that, I think one of the Sam's early diagrams showed, you know, when the site selection process happens. I think that's a critical part of the equation, so that you can make sure that you've reviewed the potential sites with elders and cultural leaders who may know that if there's a cultural site there, so that the architects and engineers don't get underway only to find out later on, well, you can't build there. So I think, you know, it really is a schedule risk, but it is absolutely, you know, critical to do that upfront planning, so that you don't end up in a situation like Sam described with those extreme site costs.
Yeah. Not only just the cost of either the site or adding utilities or having to build a water treatment plant on your site. Oftentimes, you know, sites don't have the sewer or running water or electricity to the site. So that's one thing. One project I worked on recently was for my own tribe, the White Earth Nation, and they were expanding their hospitality into a new site where they owned land in trust. And what eventually got in the way after about a year of working on the project was actually the community. And the community was divided over whether to build on this site or not in central Minnesota, not because of any of those kind of site constraints, but because the trust land was originally dedicated as wild rice preserve. And so even though the lake had, you know, plenty of wild rice, they had one small little slot on a lake in central Minnesota, and people who were on the economic sort of let's build and let's earn money and generate revenue for the tribe wanted to do the gaming and hotel facility there. The cultural folks, on the other hand, were very adamantly opposed, saying that was historically one of the few places in the community where their wild ricing treaty rights were to be held in perpetuity. And so after a very long battle, I guess what really happened was an election. The project got canceled. And again, that was because of, I think in the end, if I look back, what should have happened is more consensus building within the community. The gaming commission and the tribal council wanted to go forward with it, and they kind of went forward with it. But the community members didn't all have a say in early on. And so in any project that we're going on, in any community, you have to have the right people at the right time, and that's early on in a project.
All right, thank you so much. That was a great response. Sam, what other questions do we have?
I had a question. So I think I guess I just sort of want maybe like to throw a scenario at you. I think that in Chickaloon, it's a place where I think most of our tribe really values the fact that that our lands, our landscapes, our native allotments are somewhat preserved and untouched, which is interesting, that situation that you just presented where there was like a bit of a divide on what to do with the land. How would you, I would say in many ways we're in the very early stages of even deciding what we want. How would you propose doing visioning sessions with tribal communities, with council? What would be like your process for the beginning stages in that visioning?
Yeah, different communities like to operate in different ways. One of the first things to do is the tribal council ultimately often has final say. Getting them on board with this visioning process is one of the key things, is to, first of all, set it up so that it's a community dialogue, and that every voice is valued, so that people don't feel they've been excluded from the conversation, so that people are all on the same page of getting to some sort of consensus. I've been in many different projects where these type of meetings can be a little contentious, and there's times I've stood up in front of a 200 room full of people who were all yelling at me, but really they were kind of upset with their tribal council, and that's not always fun. But it's like we're the messenger, not the deciders. So there's a lot of delicacy, and I'm trying to answer the question delicately, because every community has its own internal social and political scenario. Luckily, with a museum and cultural facilities, these are things that people can usually latch on and get on board with. And so understanding and establishing the high level goals, first of all, is to understand, okay, what are we really doing here? We're preserving our culture for the next generation. We are preserving our language. We're finding a place for people to gather. So focusing on the parts of the project that everyone can agree on first, I think is maybe what I'm trying to say here, is that it's hard to argue against cultural preservation, especially with what's happening in tribal communities all over the country. So the question would be what kind of facility can we build? What's in it? Who's going to visit it? How can we create something that will help us reach those broader common goals? Starting off with some of the contentious stuff maybe is something that will derail a project right away.
Right, to expand on that a little bit, I think I always go back to the strategic plan. That if there's a good process on the strategic plan, that the community, that the council have reached consensus on the values for the project and the goals and objectives, then once it gets to the design team, the best thing that we can do to help safeguard the continued consensus building is to evaluate alternative sites, alternative configurations of the buildings, as Sam has so well described, particularly with evaluating alternate sites. That's a way of bringing the community into the process to elicit different values for different sites, and helps ensure that the process doesn't get too far down a path that ultimately has roadblocks or can't be realized or should not be realized.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Those are interesting answers to evaluate. I think that it's hard for me to like conceptualize where my tribe is, and like where we, you know, do our cultural activities, and think of a museum being there, you know, and think of kind of like what that museum would look like and for what purpose, and who would come in the doors. But I think what you guys said is like who would gather there is, I think, really something that struck a chord with me, and I will take back to my community. So thank you.
The other thing is to maybe challenge your idea of what you think a museum is or a cultural center, because there's no definition to what it is. If you tell people museum, instantly they start thinking about their own preconceptions of what that means. It's sort of, it's like asking 10 people to give them a piece of paper and say, draw a tree. You know, someone's going to draw a pine tree, someone's going to draw a bonsai tree. You know, they're all going to come up with whatever they're in the mood for at that point. So there really is no definition. So it's what are the goals? Is the goal to preserve language? Then you can backtrack into, okay, maybe we need a large space that people can gather and hear the language. Maybe we need small spaces for language groups to study. Maybe, you know, if one of the goals is to preserve art, maybe it's not just preserving art that was done 50, 100 years ago, but maybe it's a place for teaching art now. So kind of rethinking everything is incredibly important, because you have to design. You're not really designing a building. You know, in the end, architecture is 95% culture and sociology and community building. Yes, there are walls and ceilings and roofs, and yes, we have to draw drawings to get them built, but it's really translating a community's vision of who they want to be into place. And this idea of placemaking is about, okay, how do we create some sort of central location, or as I mentioned before, sometimes it's 5 locations within a community that can achieve whatever goals it is that that you're trying to find. So again, those broad, high-level goals are the most important to start off with. And again, if you start off with a site, you're also limited to what can actually be built on that site. So as I mentioned before in the presentation, I have 2 projects where we don't even know where the buildings are actually going to be yet, but they know what they want them to be. And that's in those 2 cases, it's a successful visioning process. Now we got to find sites for them. And then there's other times when we've designed a facility like a library or other facilities where as we get into the community engagement process, the building changed completely from that function to something else, just because when you actually listen to what people want, you can help them uncover what type of facility meets those goals.
I think one of the things that Sam said in his presentation that was really quite interesting, and something that we work to incorporate in our tribal museums and cultural centers, is this idea that the experience isn't necessarily the same for everyone. And one of the things that you have to talk about, we talked a little bit about this last week, is who's the audience, who's it for, and certainly the relationship, the sensitivity of places of traditional practice are not to be kind of overstated. They're huge issues, but there are ways to design buildings where there's one entrance for the community and one entrance for guests. And so one place can be read in very different ways and could be a strategy for dealing with a place of tradition. It's very challenging to do, but certainly a worthwhile exploration.
Wow, thank you. Thank you both. Shanann.
All right, do we have any other questions?
This is Colleen from Hopi. I didn't really have a question, but just kind of wanted to share our nightmare of how we're starting all over again. Our project is, like I said, over 40 years old, and the site selected in the past, we had to go back on those decisions because of eagle nests that were there, and through we still take care, have eagle practitioners and take care of eagles. So there's a law of how within a radius of I would say I think it's like 5 miles that there's no development. So we had to check those plans, and then we had to check another plan of ranchers and people not wanting any development in that area. So that deal was checked also, and we also had architectural planning from the most prestigious architects in the world, Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill. We had them working with us, and we have all architectural plans on that, and that had to have taken a lot of money. And for some reason, those plans had just stopped. So we're trying to piece back together all this history of what has been planned and redo it again, which is probably like the 4th time it's happened. And so we've wasted a lot of money. We wasted a lot of credibility within our people of like trying to be something we're not as far as a museum. We have a bad history with museums of what has been done to our people with auctions in France, being exploited in the past. So our people are like, why do we even want a museum? Why do we even want to be like that? And so we had to look at all of these plannings and push forward in a new direction. And that's why we, it's very hard to explain that we want a museum and our name is Hopi Belt Learning Center, because we didn't want to go back to that idea of wanting to be something we're not. And so that's why we chose not to be labeled as a museum, but it's very hard to go into the public and articulate that we would have exhibits, learning space, and all these areas that you normally find in museums without calling ourselves a museum. And so I'm very happy to hear this information that we have to go through throughout the years. And it's just, you just really have to be careful about the site selection. I mean, 40 years later, we're still going through the site selection and all the controversy of where would be a good area for us, and we finally, hopefully, found it. So it's just sharing a little bit of where we're at in our scenario of building a learning center / museum. But yeah, we've went through all of that that you're talking about, and I'm just sitting here. I'm just like, oh my gosh, we went through that. We're going. I would hate to go through that again. So I think showing this perspective not only to the planning team but the community would kind of help let them understand where we're at and how we plan to move forward. That's all. Just wanted to share that. Just hearing it, it's just like, wow, we went through all of that already, and now we're trying to push forward again.
One of the key things in any project like this is, especially ones that might take a long time to get done, is continuity in the people who are working on it, and that can be difficult. It's asking the tribal council to designate people in the community, cultural leaders or educational leaders, to spearhead, to do a more of a working group. There's often some difficulty when the tribal council is the one making the decisions in a project, because councils change over time. There's also turnover in every organization, but in order to have a project be successful, you need that continuity, and you also need to build and keep momentum going. So never let a project go a couple months without having some sort of engagement with the community or engagement with the council, because if people forget about it, people will forget about it. The other thing about making an investment in something like this, you talked about having full architectural drawings for a facility. You can work with an architect to go through different phases of the project, maybe only up to pre-design or schematic design, and stop there and make sure you get the consensus that you need. Because if you have the architect, spend a lot of time putting construction documents together, and that doesn't get built, then yes, that's an effort that didn't need to happen. So there's creative ways of working with design professionals to go as far as you need to get to whatever it is the goal is at that point. And again, transparency with the community is what I've seen as being one of the most important factors of getting a project done.
Hi, this is Gloria from Hopi as well. The design plans that were created, and architectural design plans were done in the 80s. So as Colleen has stated, this is a project or an effort that's been spanning over the years. And we did go through a site evaluation of 4 potential sites for a museum cultural center. And like Colleen has stated, museum, the word museum has a negative connotation for Hopi because of the past history of materials and our ancestors being removed from our lands and held or moved to museums across the country and in other countries. So we're having to rebuild the trust of what a cultural facility can provide, and not using the term museum within our title, but explaining, what we intend to present within a museum cultural center-like facility titled the Hopi-Viwat Learning Center. And Hopi-Viwat means lifeways, Hopi lifeways. So Hopis that understand the language understand the meaning of what we're talking about and what we would like to present for the people within a facility, along with educating the general public of visitors that come into Hopi wanting to visit our homeland. So it's been a long effort and a lot of money spent in different stages. So we're picking up the building blocks and moving on.
There's an important discussion going on in the chat. I want to make sure that everybody is aware of. There's people are talking about a NEPA assessment, a 106 assessment, an environmental assessment. Does everybody have a sense of what those are? Would it be helpful for us to talk about that? I know Matt could give a whole.
That would be good.
So NEPA, and Sam, jump in. NEPA is a National Environmental Protection Act. So if there's federal money involved, and that's to make sure that projects aren't damaging wetlands. Sam talked about that a little bit. And habitat, and also it also gets into hazardous materials. It does get a little bit into historic. 106 is referring to, a 106 review is referring to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which wants to make sure that federal dollars aren't unknowingly causing what's called an adverse effect on something that's eligible or on the National Register of Historic Places. An environmental assessment is something that could be less formal or could be more formal, but often done when it's not, often in my experience, we try to do it regardless of whether it's required, just to make sure that there's no surprises. We can go into any more detail, but I wanted to make sure people would just at least understood those acronyms. And someone has shared a screenshot, which I'm trying to download.
Yeah, the funding process is really important, not only for NEPA, but some of you may be a tribal organization, some of you may be a nonprofit. I've worked with both who are fundraising for a project. Some projects don't like to do their drawings until they're about 80% funded. They don't like to pull the trigger on the final stages of that, so that they know they're going to do it. So that can alleviate the effort of going through an entire design process before you raise the funds, and using that that document to raise funds. You can raise funds on a pre-designed document that has some basic planning, a site, some inspirational images, and that's often enough to get that process moving forward. And again, getting people excited about that. It's hard to fundraise for a project when people don't know what it looks like. So having a few schematic renderings, and I showed some of them in the presentation, but and drawing it just enough to get people excited and to see the vision, to see how it ties to culture, how it ties to function, show people inside of it using it the way the community asked for. That often gets you very far in what you need to actually fundraise for the project.
In my experience, like an IMLS planning grant would not trigger a NEPA review because it's exactly, often it's doing what Sam just referenced, kind of really establishing that vision. The NEPA and 106 reviews are really done once the project is real and construction is scheduled.
I had a question about several of the cohort members have indicated that they will be applying for ICDBG grants, Indian Development Community Block Grants. And it's my understanding that you have to involve the Army Corps of Engineers early on in that and site approval. Is that the case? And if so, what is that process like?
I've used many projects that I've worked on have used ICDBG funds, and we've never once contacted the Army Corps. Don't tell them if we're supposed to.
Okay.
I think it depends. I would assume it depends on the project. Sam, do you have an experience with that?
I have not had to do that either. And again, yeah, don't tell anyone. No, but the thing about funding sources, I had a project that's under construction now. It had 31 different funding sources. Now it's a affordable housing project, which is maybe a little bit of a different type of project, but many of the funders didn't have any kind of requirements and others do. So understanding the multiple different overlapping requirements from each funder can be challenging as well. I have the Red Lake Community Center that I showed had USDA funding as part of it, and then it had a grant from a tribe for the other half. So we had to actually draw two different sets of drawings for the building that would comply with each of the different, essentially the granting agency's requirements. USDA requires a whole lot of paperwork and process that in a lot of ways kind of, it's there to protect the project and it's there to protect their money, but it also kind of slows everything down a little bit. So just being aware, first of all, always be thankful for any funding that you're given and comply with the requirements, but just make sure that everyone is aware of the process because then we're not, as architects, we're not always told what are in the kind of the fine print of these things. So I usually ask in any of my projects that gets grant funding a copy of the grant so that I can review from a requirement standpoint what are all the different things that we all have to do.
That's good. We have scheduled 3 fundraising webinars that will occur in July. Is that right, Melissa?
May and June.
May and June. Thank you. But they will discuss the fundraising sources and some of the requirements, and also provide you with an overlay of how you tie fundraising into the development of the project. You know what has to happen when, according to your funding sources. So we'll be getting to that later on in the project. Great questions, by the way.
Great. Any other questions?
That's good to know because I was wanting to ask about, the funding portions and, how, what funding would be available to us, what funding might be given to us, as far as the tribe. I spoke with my council when I submitted the application and they're all on the board, they're all aware. they were in the process of doing a tribal ordinance, a resolution. So they did do that. And that is a document. And I wanted to know if you guys wanted me to send that to you as with a part of my application. Because I know when I sent the application, I wasn't able to send in that tribal ordinance because they've, all this happened, the COVID, and everything changed. I mean, we're all on furlough, we're all, at home, but the tribal administration, they're still meeting, and they did draw up the resolution. And if I could get that to you, I really want to, because I know that was a part of my application that, stopped, before I was able to get it to you, because we were going to meet with the council, and I was going to give them a presentation of, the whole cohort and all this information. This is really exciting for me, because now I'm able to, give them more information on due process, of the site selection, of the topography, of the requirements, of, all the stuff, the community engagement, the fundraising, all the stuff that, that we need to look at as a community, and not just, them. They need to come together and say, okay, we're going to have a general meeting. We need to look at all these aspects, and, what do you think? So I'm really excited about all this, and the webinars, and I'm looking forward, to the fundraising webinars and any other funding sources that are out there that we're able to tap into, so we can progress forward with this. And I really do appreciate all this.
Well, we appreciate you, and yes, we would like to have that resolution, because we're all in this together. We're a team, and it's a pilot project, and so we're trying to gather as many resources as we can, as many sample materials as we can, so that you can also learn from each other. So if you have materials that you would like to share with the cohort, which means eventually they'll be shared with the world, because they'll be on a website that is accessible to everybody. If you want to share those with us, we would like to include them on our website. Hi, Lillian. Who are those beautiful girls?
This is my daughter Jade, my baby, and this is my granddaughter Paisley.
Hi.
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 Nice to see you. Anyway, send us your resources, and for instance, if you have a feasibility study or anything that you can share with the public, we would like to provide examples to others.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations on the resolution.
All right, any other questions or comments?
Hi, this is Stormy from the Port Gamble Slalom Tribe. I just wanted to say something I think that I took out of this was really about reflecting on your tribe's values for what you want to put into your cultural center, museum, or whatever you're calling it. I do a lot of work, and as a tribe, we're always fighting development off the reservation, that are in our sacred sites and things. And so remembering to kind of keep with that on the reservation too, as we're developing our own communities, is really important. So that's probably the biggest thing I took out of your presentation, Sam. So thank you for that.
Well, I'll just add to that, because I'm glad that that's what you got out of it. In your area, Snoqualmie tribe just recently had to buy back their falls as part of that's their creation story. They had to buy it, and they had to actually buy it back from a different tribe. They now control some sacred lands adjacent to that that housing was going to be built on. So the idea of site and place and land, it's maybe we could touch on this in more detail, but it's about securing our land base and getting it back. It's not just about selecting a site for a building. And remember that our cultural heritage sites are also sacred sites. We don't need a building to go and pray. We don't need a building to go and experience culture. A couple hundred years ago, there weren't really these types of buildings. We didn't have steel and concrete, and so I think that's important to think about, is what is the actual role of the building itself. It's just one place and it's static, but people move and the landscape moves, and thinking about it in that way, that there's cultural preservation in terms of our land base, but also restoring the land that we do get back, because it's often dirty, it's often had a gas station on it, it's often contaminated. So if we can get back our land, restore it, and that's one of the most important things I'm seeing happening around the entire country. And I hope your tribes are engaged in that fully as well. Then the other piece maybe I'll leave is that comprehensive planning for an entire community is incredibly important. And what that means is that you're not only just planning one site. So a tribe might have a bunch of different lands, and oftentimes it's checkerboarded because of the history of tribal land. But understanding what the entire community, how it works as a land base, is incredibly important. I've been on a number of projects where I've started designing conceptual plans for a building, and another department in the same tribe is also doing the same project, but they weren't talking to each other. So that's always an interesting situation. But so the idea of engaging and transparency between different departments in your tribe is important. I'm working with a tribal college department, and their president of the college didn't know that was happening and had different ideas for that site. So there has to be that open transparency and discussion, because we don't want to do to each other what was done to us with our land base. And I think, again, the community, just the act of gathering and talking about and deciding as a group what happens to our land is incredibly important.
Oh, that's very true. Very true. So if there are any other questions? No? Well, Sam, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I know that I learned a whole lot. And I know next week we look forward to seeing your next presentation.
Yes.
And I hope you all have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Everybody, nice to see you guys.
Nice to see you.
Good night.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody.